Shalom. Welcome to Lights of the Nations. We're now ready to begin the second chapter, Perek Bet, of Maimonides' Hilchot Beit HaBechira, the Rambam's classic work, The Laws of the Chosen House. And this chapter, as we shall see, is totally taken up with the subject of the altar, the outer altar, the altar of the offerings, sometimes referred to as the brass altar. We have to see why. And the altar really is the heart, the foundation, the center of everything that goes on in the Holy Temple. Interestingly, in the beginning of this chapter, Maimonides gives us a historical view, a historical summary and perspective of the significance of the place of the altar and some other details regarding the concept of the altar in history and its perpetuity, the eternal connection that the altar has with the Jewish people and really with all of humanity from, as we'll see, the very dawning of time up until our very generation. So, beginning with Halacha Aleph in this chapter, HaMizbeach Mekomo Mechuvan Biyoter. This is a very unusual expression which Maimonides uses here. And in fact, we don't find an expression like this used again by Maimonides, and rarely do we find this type of expression anywhere. He says, the altar, its location is exceedingly specific. Very, very specific. Ve'ena mishaninoto mimkomo leolam, and it may never be changed. We can never change the place of the altar. Shne'amar, because there's actually a verse that states, V'zeh mizbech leolah Yisrael. This verse, as we see in Chronicles, in the first book of Chronicles, tells us this is the altar of offering for Israel. There are several factors in this specific idea of the location of the altar. One of the factors is the fact that the patriarchs all had an intense relationship with Hashem at this place, but there's also the idea that Hashem himself, and this is really what's reflected in this verse in Chronicles, Hashem himself chose this spot from the very beginning. But first, let us examine a little bit the relationship with the forefathers. And Maimonides continues, Uba Mikdash Ne'akad Yitzchak Avinu. It was, and here the Rambam says, it was in the temple, even though of course the temple was not at that time standing, but he refers to Mount Moriah as the Mikdash, the temple. It was in this spot that our forefather Isaac was bound. Shene'amar, V'lech lecha el eretz ha-Moriah. As Hashem told Avraham Avinu, as God instructed Abraham, our father, in the 22nd chapter of Genesis, God said, go for yourself to the land of Moriah. V'ne'amar b'divrei hayamim. And it also states again in Chronicles, in this verse, Vayachel Shlomo, this verse tells us that King Solomon began to build the house of Hashem in Jerusalem, in Mount Moriah, in that very place which King David, his father, prepared, the place of the threshing floor of Aravna, the Jebusite. This in 2nd Chronicles. And essentially what Maimonides is doing in this halacha is he is really providing us with a historical backdrop that this place was singular and was chosen from the very beginning. As we're going to see in the next halacha, really the reason why it is, again, mechuvan biyoter, why it is so specific, why it is so exceedingly precise, is because this was in fact the very place of the creation of Adam Harishon, the first man. It's interesting to note that the word Moriah, Mount Moriah, really only appears in the entire Torah twice. And Maimonides actually here in this halacha, Halacha Aleph, mentions those two citations. The first time that Moriah is mentioned in the Torah is in fact when God instructs the patriarch Abraham to go to the land of Moriah. That is concerning the commandment of Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. And the second time is in fact when King Solomon begins to build the house for Hashem, as we have quoted. So this particular entry, the first one in the second chapter about the altar, already establishes the fact that the place of the altar is so important that it can never be budged or changed or moved in any way. And this comes from the connection that our forefathers have with this place. After all, our forefathers really were the instigators, the very initiative behind the divine service. And further back, it was actually significant yet at the time of the creation of man. But what's interesting is that even though, as we mentioned, the word Moriah only appears twice in the Torah, and the Rambam here mentions those two locations. Now, on the one hand, the Rambam tells us that the location of the altar is exceedingly specific, can never be moved, it's very, very important. But yet, where is that location exactly? You understand what I'm trying to say? On the one hand, Maimonides tells us, the location of the altar is extremely specific and can never be moved, because it was in the place of the temple that Isaac was bound. Hashem told Avraham to go to the land of Moriah, the same Moriah which later we read about that King Solomon began to build the house of Hashem in that same Moriah. But where exactly is this? And where on Mount Moriah is this specific location of the altar? Thus we come to Halacha Bet, the second entry in this chapter, where the Rambam tells us, Umasoret biyad hakol shehamakom shabana bo David u'Shlomo hamizbech begoren aravna hu hamakom shabana bo Avraham hamizbech va'akad alav Yitzchak. The Rambam tells us it is a universally accepted tradition. Another very unusual expression. It tells us it is accepted by everyone, by all. A universally accepted, and he uses the word tradition, or masoret biyad hakol, that place, the place in which David and his son Shlomo built the altar in the threshing floor of Aravna, that is the very place where Avraham built his altar and bound his son Isaac, Yitzchak. And then Maimonides continues and tells us, V'hu hamakom shabana bo Noach kishiatza min hateva. This is the same place where Noah built an altar to offer the offerings to the Creator after the flood, when he exited the ark. V'hu hamizbeach shehikriv alav Kain v'Hevel. This is the very same altar upon which Cain and Abel brought their respective offerings. Ubo hikriv adam harishon korban kishenivra. And this is the very same location where Adam harishon, the first man, built an altar and brought an offering. Umisham nivra. And from this very place, Adam himself was created. Amru chachamim. And Maimonides cites a very important statement of our sages. Our sages have stated, Adam mimakom kaparato nivra. Man is actually created from the very spot that brings atonement for him. So, let us analyze what Maimonides is telling us in this particular halacha, and really why. Because this halacha actually is a very brief summary of the history, generation by generation, of the temple, and specifically the heart of the temple, the central point of the temple, the altar. After all, in the previous halacha, halacha aleph, we have this concept of the immovable aspect of the altar, how important it is for it to be very specifically in that location. And here, Maimonides really begins with the era of Solomon and David, and then goes back in time all the way to Adam, to the first man. Actually, the location of the place of the temple, as it is explained by our sages, if we would go back to the fact that in the Tanakh the word Moriah is only mentioned twice, the question will arise, as we have said, well, where exactly is this most specific of spots that is so important? And that's why the Rambam actually emphasizes here in the beginning of this halakha, it's actually a beautiful continuation of halakha aleph. He says it is a tradition. It is a universally accepted tradition without any exception whatsoever that this is the place that is known to us from an unbroken tradition, generation after generation. And really that is, for Maimonides here, the word of law. That we have this idea, this concept of how specific the altar must be because of its tremendous, staggering significance all the way back through time, all the way to Adam himself. And that point, meaning the point that that history all unfolded and took place at a very specific location which we actually know about, which has been passed down generation to generation from rabbi to student in an unbroken fashion. About that, he says, there's no question that we have this intact tradition regarding the place of the altar. Now, interestingly as well, you know, the first time in the Torah where the word Mizbeach actually appears is in conjunction with Noah. This is a very interesting point. The first time that we actually encounter the word Mizbeach in the Torah is regarding the altar that Noah built. We have a tradition from our sages that Adam built an altar and that he also brought an offering. It is written in the Torah that Cain and Abel brought offerings. But the word Mizbeach is not used until the time of Noah. This is the first mentioning. And regarding Noah, the location is not given. But because of the unique and singular nature of the word Mizbeach and the concept of the altar in the Torah, it's quite obvious to our sages that when Noah built his altar, it was in the place, the one singular location chosen by Hashem, sanctified by Him from the very beginning of time, through, as we'll see, as we have seen, as we'll continue to explain, through the creation of Adam himself, that when Noah built his altar, it was clearly in the very same place, because this really was to be, from the very beginning of time, the arena for this type of unfolding relationship, this unfolding contact that man has with God. Interesting also here, the Rambam mentions Cain and Abel. And there is a controversy amongst our sages as to what their whole argument was all about, as to what the whole problem was in their getting along. And one particular opinion regarding Cain and Abel is that they were actually arguing over in whose portion would the Holy Temple eventually be built. And so here also there is this type of connection between that early offering and the Holy Temple. Actually, the verse recalls that when they were in the field, this is actually the wording of the verse in the book of Genesis. When they were in the field, it was that Cain rose up and slew his brother. And as we have seen, the field, the Sadeh, is actually the location of the Holy Temple. That is actually the conceptualization of our forefather Isaac. Vayetze Yitzchak lasuach basadeh. Isaac went out to meditate in the field, and if you remember, we discussed the fact that Avraham related to the Temple Mount as a mountain, Yitzchak as a field, Yaakov as a house. Also later, regarding the incident of the blessing, when Yitzchak smelled the garments that his son wore, he recalled the scent of the field that Hashem has blessed. And this, our sages also say, is an allusion to that particular field, the location of the Holy Temple. And the Rambam ends this entry by telling us that not only was this the place upon which Abraham bound Isaac, the place that Noach built an altar, the place of Cain and Hevel, and the place at which Adam Harishon, Adam, the first man, actually brought his offering, but he tells us this is the place from where Adam was created. This is a really a staggeringly beautiful concept. The idea that our sages tell us, Adam mimakom kaparato nivra, that Adam was actually created from the very spot that brings about atonement for him. This actually coincides with a thought that is expressed in the Talmud about how before time, before God brought time into existence, this is the expression of our sages in the Talmud, it's in Tractate Pesachim, there were 7 primordial thoughts that ascended in the divine consciousness before God actually brought creation into being. He thought about 7 specific things, and these 7 things are connected, and there's a certain theme, and one of those things that he thought about, as it were, before creating the world was, in fact, the Holy Temple. This, I think, is very related to this concept that Adam mimakom kaparato nivra, that Adam was actually created from the very spot that brings about atonement for him. And basically the idea here is that God foresaw that man is, in fact, fallible, and that man, by his very nature, by the very concept of the human condition, man will stray away from God and from the proper path. He will not be able to maintain his balance all the time. And so God actually hewed into the very fabric of creation the ability for man to return to him, to realign himself with his sense of divine purpose. And as we've mentioned and emphasized really consistently, that's really a major aspect of the experience in the Holy Temple, and especially the experience of bringing an offering, as we'll speak about more in the coming weeks, the idea of regaining a certain sense of balance that perhaps we've lost. So this in itself, the conclusion of Halacha Bet, is actually the most important bridge and the answer really to the issues of Halacha Aleph, of why the Mizbeach has to be in such a specific location, why its location can never be changed, even by a millimeter, why it's mechuvan bioter, why it is so exceedingly specific, not only because of Avraham and Yitzchak, not only because of Abraham and Isaac and Noah and Cain and Abel, but because this is the very place from which Adam himself was created. And thus, the experience of bringing an offering to the altar is, in a sense, the closing of a circle for every person who is a descendant of Adam. It is this closing of a circle and coming back to the very spot, as our sages so succinctly say, that brings about atonement, meaning that brings about the cleansing, the clarification of our direct relationship with God. Halacha Gimel, Maimonides tells us that just as the location of the altar is very specific, and in fact there is a universally accepted tradition regarding the specific coordinates of this tradition, so too regarding the appearance of the altar and how it is to be built. Midot hamizbeach mechuvanot harbe. The attributes, the dimensions of the altar are also quite specific. Vitsurato yidua ish meish. And the form, the shape, the components of the altar are well known and handed down from one person to another throughout the ensuing generations. So just as the location of the altar is known, is specific, is beyond any question regarding its nature, so too the details of the altar have also been handed down from the very beginning. However, you may notice the fact that the dimensions in the tabernacle were not the same as the dimensions of the altar in the first temple, and the dimensions of the altar in the first temple also differed from the dimensions of the altar in the second temple. So Maimonides continues and tells us, Umizbech shabanu b'nei hagola, the altar that was built by the returning exiles, those who came back after the first exile, Ke'ein mizbech she'atid lihibanot asuhu. They made it similar, somewhat like the altar which in the future is to be built, meaning the altar in Ezekiel's vision. But, the Rambam concludes, Ve'ein lahosif al midato v'lo ligroa mimena. However, we must not add to its dimensions or subtract from it. And Maimonides is going to explain this and clarify it further. Basically, the idea is that according to Jewish law, as here codified by the great Rambam, we are essentially commanded to build the altar in accordance with its appearance in the era of the Second Temple. For indeed, our sages of blessed memory derive the dimensions of the altar from the vision of Ezekiel, the vision regarding the future temple. So, in other words, those who came back after the first exile and rebuilt the Second Temple in those humble origins and began to build the temple of that era, built the altar according to their understanding of the way that it appears in Ezekiel's vision, and as it will be rebuilt in the future. But it's also important to note that the dimensions of the altar, its size, the extent of its dimensions, is only something that must be manifest in what we call lechatchila. In other words, the best possible way of creating the altar according to the most desired halachic principle is according to these measurements. However, there is an important ruling in Jewish law that ultimately the size of the altar is not an impediment to the fulfillment of its job in the Holy Temple. So if all of the other conditions which Maimonides is going to teach us in the ensuing halachot, if all of those other conditions are met, but for some reason it is impossible to build the altar according to the larger size, that would not be an impediment for the altar being kosher for use in the temple. In halacha dalid, in the fourth halacha, Maimonides tells us, Ushlosha nevi'im alu imahem min hagolah, that when the exiles returned from the Babylonian exile at the conclusion of the 70 years, 3 prophets came back to the land of Israel with the returnees. These 3 prophets actually were the last 3 prophets that arose for the Jewish people, namely Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And each one of these men had a specific mission regarding the altar in the temple. Echad he'id lahen al makom hamizbeach. One of these men gave testimony as to the exact place of the altar. Ve'echad he'id lahen al midotav. And one of them gave testimony, bore witness as to its exact dimensions. Ve'echad he'id lahen shemakrivin al hamizbeach hazeh kol hakarbanot afal pi she'en sham boit. And the third gave a very important piece of information, and that is the principle that the service of the altar may be renewed, offerings can be brought on the altar, in fact all of the offerings, even if the house itself has not yet been built. And this in fact, as we see in this illustration, this in fact was reflected in the verses that we read about in the book of Ezra, that the divine service was actually resumed once the altar had been built, even though the temple itself had still not been rebuilt, and in fact it still lay in ruins. The service of the altar was renewed. So the important principle here that Maimonides is adding for us in this 4th entry of our 2nd chapter of Hilchot Beit HaBechira is that during this era, the era of the beginning of the Second Temple, the tradition which Maimonides referred to earlier, the unbroken, universally accepted tradition regarding the place of the altar, and in fact the form of the altar again, which he says was also handed down orally from generation to generation, those traditions were substantiated through the eyewitness testimony of these three prophets who basically gave witness to these three basic fundamental halachot, which are tied to the purpose of the altar and its essence. Namely, the 3 points are its place, its size, and the fact that it is indeed possible and sanctioned by the Torah to renew the divine service of the altar, even if the sanctuary still lies in desolation. It's important to note that the function of these three men here, in this case, historically, was not as prophets. They did not prophesize, and this was not a question of any sort of divine guidelines, divine intervention, or revelation. They simply fulfilled the role of eyewitnesses who, returning from the previous era, were able to give over the information of what they remembered from the epoch of the First Temple. And so, as we continue in our study of Maimonides, Hilchot Beit HaBechira, laws regarding the altar, we'll see that the way has been prepared for us for the return of the divine presence into the world, the light to Israel, and the light to the nations.